Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. Yes, I will be presenting on our results that we recently achieved on an 18-month study within the SIENNA project on the ethical analysis of AI and robotics technologies. So this is based on our SIENNA report with the same title. It can be downloaded from our website. It's currently available. It's more than 200 pages, so quite extensive report. So what we do in this report is we identify and analyze ethical issues in relation to artificial intelligence and robotics. Now you may have noticed that there is a lot of discussion nowadays about ethical issues in AI, but a lot of the discussion, at least in policy circles, centers around ethical guidelines or ethical guidance. That's different from what the focus is in our report. So in our we have other reports. Some of them not published yet, but finished, that go into ethical guidelines for AI and their implementation in concrete practices. But this is different from that. This is about ethical issues. So the difference is that ethical guidelines provide guidance for actions that involve AI and robotics. So if you have these ethical guidelines, you can use those guidelines to kind of assess or evaluate how you should act or whether certain actions or technologies or processes are ethical. When we talk about ethical issues, we are talking about particular ethical challenges raised by AI technology or its application. So ethical guidelines may help us find such ethical challenges, but such ethical challenges are not solely defined by these ethical guidelines. They're more complicated than just what a single guideline or set of guidelines may reveal about them. So that's why we think it's important to be aware of what are the key ethical issues in AI and robotics, and moving beyond existing sets of guidelines. So if you look at recent ethical guidelines for AI, there have been several. In Europe, of course, the most prominent have been the requirements for ethical and trustworthy AI of the high-level expert group on AI, the so-called ethics guidelines for trustworthy artificial intelligence. Those have become well known rather quickly in the past year. Then we also have the OECD principles on AI, which have a lot of similarities in my view with the high-level expert group guidelines, as well as the IEEE guidelines for ethically aligned design. And then there are many other organizations at the country level or at professional organizations, companies. Nowadays, UNESCO is also working on global guidelines for AI. So a lot of activity in this field, but we won't be concerned with it today, at least not directly. So what you can see in these kinds of guidelines is that they're usually very general. They sometimes can be summed up with one word, like privacy or transparency. So they are very global values or principles that express a kind of direction or a wish list for AI development and use. So while these kinds of requirements will play a role in our analysis of ethical issues, then my point is that they're different from the ethical issues that we'll be looking at. So what is missing then, if you can put it that way, in these guidelines is this focus on specific ethical issues. And specific ethical issues deal with specific features or risks associated with AI and robotics, or issues in relation to specific techniques or products or services in this area, or issues in relation to specific application domains or user groups. So what we did in our study then is to identify what we see as important ethical issues, as already currently featured in literature, academic literature, or issues that we can anticipate, because we also anticipated future developments of the technology over the next 20 years. So included in our list is also potential future ethical issues. So what we did is we investigated ethical issues in AI and robotics at 3 levels. The first is what we call the technology level. That's the most general level of description, where you're basically looking at AI as a whole, and kind of general features, implications, and risks associated with AI and robotics technology. So we tried to then identify what are ethical issues with AI in general. Next, we look at the artifact level. That is a level of description where we don't look at the technology in general, but we look at specific types of products, artifacts, or functional procedures or techniques in the field, in both AI and robotics. And we look at ethical issues specifically associated with these kinds of products or functional procedures. And third, we look at the application level. By that we mean the use of products or functional procedures in particular domains or contexts, or for particular purposes or by particular user groups. And so then here we also look at specific ethical issues within those application domains. For example, domains like healthcare or defense, or in relation to user groups like children or people with disabilities. So let us start with general ethical issues. And this is the one place where you may see some resemblance to the kind of general ethical guidelines in relation to AI. Because if we look at some of the general risks associated with AI, these often correspond to the kind of general values and principles that are proposed in ethical guidelines. But we actually have 3 categories of general ethical issues here at this general level. The first are ethical issues that with regard to the aims of AI and its various subfields. So here we look at aims like efficiency and productivity improvement, or human AI collaboration, or super intelligence, or human cognitive enhancement. And we then ask, well, if that is your aim, your goal in developing AI, what might be ethical issues with such a goal? What might be the problems, for example, with super intelligence? And what might be the problems with efficiency and productivity improvement as a goal? So because of reasons of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Some of that will come later. Then we have ethical issues with fundamental techniques, methods, and approaches in AI. For example, the very concept of an algorithm, of course, which is not only related to AI, but of course quite central in AI as well. So how might there be ethical issues with algorithms, and what might they be? So we look at algorithm ethics. So we look at the possibility of algorithmic bias, for example. And we look at ethical issues with machine learning or with knowledge representation. And we look at machine ethics. More about that later as well. And then third, at this general level, we perceive ethical issues with regard to general implications and risks associated with the use of AI. That is, a general risk associated with AI, for example, is that it might harm privacy, or that it might lead to an unjust distribution of social goods, or that there could be misuse, right? So within that context, then we look at, well, what kinds of harms to privacy might materialize, or what kind of misuses in general of this technology could occur. Another issue here would be mass unemployment, right? This is also kind of a general worry that people have about AI, is that it would lead to mass unemployment. So going a bit more into detail, just picking a few of these. If we look at techniques, methods, and approaches, for example, you have algorithms. Algorithms raise various ethical issues. For example, the actions and inferences involved in algorithms may involve moral choices, and we want to make clear how a particular kind of decision made in an algorithm can have moral aspects, including algorithmic bias, right? If these algorithms are defined over different persons or social groups, or kind of proxies that are related to persons or social groups, then algorithms may have a differential or discriminatory treatment of these social groups or persons, and that is called algorithmic bias. Another ethical issue is the potential lack of algorithmic transparency. If you don't know how an algorithm works, how can you then be critical about it? So then we have machine learning, machine ethics. This is the idea of developing AI systems to reason in an ethical manner. So to kind of build in ethics into ethical capabilities into the system. But that also raises ethical issues. For example, there is no single standard for doing ethics. So what standard will you then choose for in that particular machine? What if something goes wrong with the ethics that you build in, that suddenly, instead of the machine wanting to preserve human life, it wants to kill all human life? Just a little program error. And so there are other ethical issues that we're looking at. If you look at general implications and risks of AI, well, there are all kinds of justice issues, like inequality of access, social impacts that are not fairly distributed over the population, functional and algorithmic bias. And then we get quite different issues, like the risk of mass unemployment. If a goal of AI is to be economically efficient, then that might involve the replacement of human labor. If AI performs better or as good as human labor and is cheaper overall, then it could replace human labor. So that could lead to mass unemployment. And yeah, what are the ethical issues with that? So then, of course, we have issues like responsibility and accountability. We have issues like transparency and explainability. Maybe those are already well known in the discussion to you in regards to also the ethical guidelines. but there are ethical guidelines, but there are also ethical issues. They are issues that we encounter generally when we think about the implications and risks of AI. So these are some of the general ethical issues we have identified at what we call the technology level. So let us now move to the artifact level, where we look at AI products first, and then also specifically to robotic systems. So we have identified a number of key AI and robotics types of systems, and we have then analyzed specific ethical issues in relation to them. So from the overview, it may look like, well, these are some of the same ethical principles again. There's privacy again, there's bias again. But the key issue here is that how are these issues manifested in relation to that particular kind of product? And then there are also other ethical issues that are not immediately defined in terms of well-known categories like privacy or autonomy or accountability. So we've looked at intelligent agents, knowledge-based systems, computer vision systems. We've looked at natural language processing, effective computing, big data analytics, embedded AI, and Internet of Things. So for each of those, we've done a somewhat extensive ethical analysis of what are key ethical issues. So again, those ethical issues are not simply defined by a key term like privacy or autonomy. It's all about the details. How specifically might effective computing undermine privacy, for example? That might be quite different from how that works in natural language processing, for example, or in other AI. For example, the private features that are being processed might be quite different, right? So, for example, in computer vision systems and in video analytics, it's images, and so we have a privacy issue with images, and then specifically, when it's humans being recorded, it's images of humans. And that might also involve facial recognition. It might involve analysis of behavior, gait. It may involve tracking. So these are specific ethical issues related then to these computer vision systems. So that's what we're trying to here to kind of map and analyze. If we move to robotics, we distinguish various robotics systems and the ethical issues that they raise as well. So one category, for example, is humanoid robots, robots that look like humans. And there, some of the issues that we identify is the possibility of misplaced moral accountability. Because the robot looks like a human, you may think that they're morally accountable. While if they wouldn't look like a human, you maybe wouldn't hold them morally accountable for their behavior. You may also have misplaced trust and empathy, never get that word right, empathy for humanoid robots. Not everybody may do that, but some people may develop that. Humanoid robots may reinforce stereotypes because many existing ones, for example, have very stereotypical portrayals of the female body, for example. And for example, humanoid robots may be used for abuse, sexual abuse or other kinds of abuse. And is that something that we find acceptable? So then we have social robots, robots that are being used in social interaction with humans and that don't necessarily have to be humanoid as well. Here we get some of these same problems of misplaced accountability, trust, and empathy. but the social robots might also lead to diminished social interaction. And because you increase your social interaction with robots, you may build up relationships with robots. You may build up less relationships with human beings. So what are the moral aspects of that? Is that desirable? Is that undesirable? Or is that something that people should freely decide for themselves? Maybe they don't have a choice. That's the kind of ethical issue we want to sort out. So then we get unmanned aerial vehicles, we get your self-driving vehicles, and yes, I think some of these ethical issues might be familiar. For example, in self-driving vehicles, a well-known ethical issue is how crash algorithms are designed. If you design, if a self-driving vehicle is about to crash, will it steer left or right? If left, they may kill one person, and right, they may kill two, but the risks are distributed differently. And maybe the person on the left is an older person, and the person on the right is a younger person. How do you decide? These kinds of ethical issues play here. So we also look at telerobotic systems, robotic exoskeletons, which bring their own ethical issues in relation to psychological well-being and physical well-being. Possible dehumanization issues might play here. There's biohybrid robots, swarm robots, which have a particular potential for military applications, micro robots, which may induce environmental degradation if they're built at a large scale. Collaborative robots bring forward particular issues of trust as well as psychological being. So as you can see, there are many specific ethical issues that are associated with these different types of AI and robotic products. So we have kind of identified, mapped, and then analyzed many such ethical issues in relation to particular types of products and functional procedures and services in the AI and robotic fields. So now moving to AI applications. So when we talk about AI applications, we're actually looking at two things. We're looking at different kinds of application domains, like healthcare and finance and defense. And we're also looking at their use by particular types of user groups, like AI being used by children, for example, or AI and robotics systems used by the elderly, and what specific ethical issues emerge there. So let us start with ethical issues in relation to AI applications. So we think this is very important because some of the key ethical issues in AI are found in these application domains. And only when you really delve into the application domain will you find these important, often novel ethical issues within those domains. And I've noticed that also the high-level expert group on AI of the European Commission has recently decided that they also want to provide guidelines for different application domains, which I think is right. But to be able to have good guidelines for those domains, you have to be aware of the ethical issues in those domains. And those we have mapped out and studied in our report. So we've looked, for example, at infrastructure in cities, including smart cities, AI applications for that. What are specific ethical issues here? We've looked at healthcare. Of course, in healthcare, the use of AI and robotics in healthcare, there are many ethical issues that are quite specialized because they deal with ethical issues in the healthcare setting. These are issues having to do with life and death. They are issues specific in relation to health, in relation to the doctor-patient relationship, in relation to clinical trials. And so it's important to be able to identify those. I will get into more detail for some of them soon. So we do the same for finance and insurance, defense. Obviously in defense, there are important ethical issues like killer robots, for example, law enforcement, the legal sector, public services and governance, retail and marketing, media and entertainment. Of course, media has been a lot in the news in recent years, especially social media and the kind of problems with social media algorithms. We look at the smart home, education and science, manufacturing, and agriculture. So we do the same for robotics. There we also look at specific issues in the application of robotics to transportation, law enforcement, defense, infrastructure, healthcare, companionship. Of course, a lot of robots being developed for companionship, especially for children, robot pets, and for adults, sex robots. But also robots for friendship and romance. So what are the ethical issues with such companionship applications? What are the effects on childcare? What are the effects on elderly care? What are the effects on how people perceive romantic relationships, etc. So we also look at manufacturing, exploration, and service sector and environment applications of robots, and the specific ethical issues that you find here. For example, environmental applications of robotics could result in environmental harms as well as benefits to the environment. There are potential issues of animal well-being and others. And we also then look at ethical issues for different types of users and stakeholders. So one issue here, for example, is gender. And gender plays a role in different ways. One way it has an impact, for example, is the implication on the labor market. AI, it has been claimed, will have a disproportionate impact on certain sectors that are dominated by women or that are dominated by men. There actually has been disagreement whether men will suffer the most from the increased application of AI and robotics, or whether it's women. So studies seem to contradict each other here, but there are probably a little bit more that say that professions that are traditionally dominated by women might suffer, and the same goes for race and ethnicity. But there are other gender issues as well. For example, we already looked at sex robots, which often involve gender stereotypes. So we look at these gender issues, we look at race and ethnicity issues. Children, of course, is a big one because the implications for children can be serious. Children are still in the developmental phase. So if they, from a young age, learn to interact with AI and with robotic systems, how does that change their mental states, the way they think, the way they feel, the way they perceive human beings? So we look at some of the ethical issues there. Same for the elderly, right? So in elderly care, there has been a big push to have ambient intelligence, robotic systems, and Internet of Things applications that can support elderly care. What are some of the ethical issues here? Will some of these systems replace human-human interaction so that elderly might become more lonely, for example? Yeah, what kinds of robots do you want for the elderly and which ones don't you want? For example, humanoid robots that they bond with, is that a good idea? And what then are the ethical issues? So we look also then at people with physical and mental disabilities, where of course AI and robotics have great potential on the one hand, but there are also ethical issues to deal with, ranging from privacy to also potential threats to autonomy and informed consent. And then finally, we look at educational and income level. So lots of ethical issues, as you see, and what I want to emphasize about those is that you can have all your ethical guidelines that you want for AI as they have been developed, these kind of documents where there are a couple pages maybe where you can list the guidelines, or even in one page, but that doesn't do much without a more thorough analysis of what the ethical issues are for the particular types of applications or systems that you want to look at. And here I think our report can provide useful complementary information. What we also did in our report is something quite different. We did studies of the academic and popular discussion of AI and robotics in different countries. So we looked at two things: the national academic ethical discussion of AI and robotics. So to the extent that there was a national academic ethical discussions, so kind of national academic journals, for example, where people published. And we looked at the national discussion of ethical, legal, and social issues with AI and robotics in popular media. And we did that study for 12 countries, many of them in the European Union, but also others. So we had France, Germany, Poland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Greece, Spain, UK, United States, China, South Africa, and Brazil. And we could do that because we actually have project partners in all these countries. So some of our findings here. First, the academic debate in different countries. A commonality was that the most discussed application areas that were featured in academic debates were defense, medicine, transportation, and the workplace. So defense, of course, you got all these issues with killer robots and military applications. Medicine, of course, you also have your life or death implications and the kind of medical ethical issues raised by the use of AI and robotic systems. Transportation, that of course involves the whole self-driving car discussion, and the workplace involves automation in the workplace and the changing nature of work, as well as also the implications of possible unemployment. And the most discussed products, we also looked at what kinds of systems or products are the most discussed. Well, that kind of corresponds a bit with the former: autonomous weapon systems, killer robots, care robots, healthcare apps, surgical robots, sex robots, and autonomous vehicles. And as for the kinds of ethical issues that were discussed, there was a wide range, but some of the ethical concepts most often used included justice, equality, autonomy, dignity, explainability, transparency, safety, accountability, liability, privacy, and data protection. So actually a list quite similar to what you find in the kind of ethical guidelines that are currently in place. We also observed that the most comprehensive national debates, academic debates that is, on AI and robotics we found to take place in the United States, in Germany, and China. Of course, all three of them countries with a lot of research capability in these areas. If we look at the popular media debates, we saw that in most countries there was substantial popular media discussion of AI and robotics. And we actually found, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, that the content of these debates largely mirrored that of the academic debates. So very much the same kinds of issues that were being discussed. We did observe that issues related to the potential economic effects of AI and robotics technology got slightly more attention in the popular media debates. So there are also interesting differences between countries, but I'm just leaving that out for now. It's also difficult to say if these are fully reliable. So coming to my conclusion, so one take-home point of my presentation today is that we need to go beyond guidelines, ethical guidelines, to also build up knowledge of ethical issues and how to approach them. And we have put forward then the SIENNA report on this as the most comprehensive existing account of these ethical issues. It's more than 200 pages. Please take a look. And finally, then we advocate that in implementing ethical and trustworthy AI, we then also need to go beyond the existing guidelines to take these ethical issues on board. Thank you very much.